Welcome to the 42nd episode of Make Pro Wrestling Majestic again at like 1:30 in the afternoon. I am Tiger Heights.
And I am the Gallery of Many Peanuts.
And we are going to do another debate because, number one, there aren't shows. Number two, we've been wanting to do this for a while. And number three, we just didn't have anything else to do. So, we are going to do the debate on intergender wrestling, on if it is a good thing for the organization or the industry as a whole, or a bad thing overall as a whole.
Okay.
We are only doing this in the context of professional wrestling because it is predetermined. So you cannot make the comparisons with MMA, football, hockey. There are different disciplines. You can't compare apples to oranges no matter what. And also, as it relates to anything with a transgender wrestling, I will be talking about it briefly, but as a positive.
Well, because we've already discussed it a long-ass time ago.
Right, but it's still a conversation. So that will be there. So this might be a little bit heavy-handed, but it is what it is, because obviously it's a big thing. So just like before, we're going to give 10 minutes for each person to showcase or to present their argument.
Right.
And then at the very end, we'll have a 15 to 20 minute open forum after that.
Okay.
So, Peanut Gallery, you will start first on your presentation.
Okay.
I have your pictures in order.
Okay.
So whenever you're ready, let's go ahead and do it. Ready?
All right.
All right. Go.
So, I'm taking the position that transgender wrestling is, or not transgender, but intergender wrestling is perfectly fine. And the reason I come to this position is because it has been a part of the history of professional wrestling almost from the very beginning. Actually, it was from the very beginning. Because wrestling has always been a part of that sideshow-esque performance. So you'd always have those sorts of test of strength matches, those folk wrestling styles, those the strong styles, the grappling, all that stuff, and it was always done as it originated as kind of a sideshow to circuses that would come into town, for example. And matches between men and women have always been a part of that tradition. And even when it became a little more on the kayfabe side, it was still an attraction. It was still a piece of that, I guess, history. The lore of professional wrestling has always had men and women competing in the same match. The first example I want to go to is way back in the 1970s with Andy Kaufman, who had a very famous rivalry with Jerry the King Lawler. And he introduced, if you go to the next picture, the concept of the intergender champion. And this was a champion that was promoted by Andy Kaufman, who was also a comedian. But he showcased it as a sort of sideshow-esque sort of performance, where men would face women, and this wrestling championship was contested by and held by both genders, males and females.
This is not the Kaufman version of the title. I think this one was presented by James Ellsworth when he was released from WWE.
Oh, but the point is that there was an intergender wrestling champion in the 70s.
Yes.
So I wanted to kind of showcase that because it is a piece of the history of what was intergender wrestling at that time. Now, Jerry the King Lawler's rivalry had a little bit to do with that whole intergender sort of rivalry, because Jerry Lawler at the time was a little more purist in his wrestling style, and it wasn't very well known back in the South. But throughout the Midwest, especially, it was very well known. It was done in county fairs, for example, and all that kind of stuff, just as, again, that sort of test of strength sort of competition that professional wrestling has been very well known for. Next picture. So moving on, major wrestling promotions throughout the 1990s like WCW, ECW, and most famously with China, the WWF, had also done a lot of intergender sort of wrestling matches, and it was very much in the same vein as being that sort of side attraction performance where you'd have the stronger women go up against the men of that era. And I think China was one of them, is actually, I think, the most famous example of women competing in men's champion and men's matches in general, because that was the most believable thing. And again, it all goes back down that same vein of that sort of test of strength thing. Next picture. And of course, we cannot talk about intergender wrestling without some sort of hardcore component, because as intergender wrestling became more featured in the mainstream, we have to have the titles or some sort of prize that these sort of sideshow skits, if you want to call them that, would take part in. And so, and again, this was not like main event sort of stuff, but it's always been a piece. It's always been a side of that sideshow attraction sort of thing. So it's always been somewhat popular within wrestling to have this sort of stuff, because it's always been a part of that history. And so going to the hardcore aspect of it, it became an easier way for people to believe in the more realism of men and women competing for the same title, because as people became more aware of the kayfabe style, you have to make people believe that women are just as capable as men, or men are just as capable as women of holding these championship titles. Moving on to the next picture. And it continues primarily in the WWE. It primarily took place within more hardcore matches, just to make it a little more believable. So there was that famous ECW 2006 One Night Stand match where Edge had done spots with, I think it was Beulah, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Beulah McGillicuddy.
Beulah McGillicuddy in that hardcore match. But again, with WWE, it's always been relegated first to the sideshows and then to kind of the hardcore style matches to make things more believable. And that's kind of the direction that intergender wrestling has gone, just to kind of adapt to the times of what people are willing to suspend that disbelief about. Move on. And the only reason today that WWE is not very well known for this is because of its PG rating. And the networks had requested to not have intergender matches between male and female competitors. Now, there have been spots and moments in which men had participated in women's matches and women had participated in men's matches, but not to the level that maybe some other promotions have a little bit more liberty about doing. Other wrestling styles have a tradition of mixed championships, for example. But especially in Mexico, men can only face men and women can only face women. But that's a cultural thing. The only promotion in which I have seen this become more prominent is AAA, especially in recent years, because that is they want to push those buttons, and Lucha Underground. So that's where it was most popular. But traditionally in Mexico, men could only face men and women could only face women, even though there were mixed gender championships, tag team championships. And so we then move on to some of the extremes. And I think the most extreme example, when people think about intergender wrestling, people think about the Kenny Omega versus the 9-year-old. And the reason that people think about this match is because this is kind of what the extreme of intergender wrestling looked like. This is why intergender wrestling has been relegated to the place that it is because you can only suspend your disbelief for so much. Going to the other end, when we talk about women actually out-competing men in situations where they win world titles from men, you kind of have to. It's really hard to explain because you need to be able to make it believable. The reason that I'm okay with intergender wrestling is primarily from a historical standpoint. It has always been a part of the lore and the history of professional wrestling. Back when kayfabe was still alive and strong, they had to adapt by making sure that the women looked and acted tough in the face of stronger competitors, or the other way around. I'm not trying to be sexist, but men tended to be stronger than women in many of these situations. My point is that intergender wrestling allows for a suspension of disbelief, but that suspension of belief can only go so far. And the reason that they are a part of the hardcore aspect now is because that allows the genders to be put on a more equal playing field.
You have 45 seconds.
And when you go too far to the extremes, people tend to not believe you. In conclusion, intergender wrestling works, but it only works in certain situations, and it should only be used when the situation itself warrants that.
Okay. Are you good?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I will stop yours, and you will do the same for me. We'll just do this in one long part, and then we'll do the open-ended discussion together.
Sounds good.
Okay. So let's go to my presentation here with my pictures, and then we'll move on from there. Ironically, I actually used the same Tessa Blanchard picture, but I'm going to do this in the opposite way because I'm actually going to argue against this ridiculousness. So just let me know when it's going.
Go.
All right. So on the opposite end of that, I believe that intergender wrestling just doesn't work in so many different ways, not just on kayfabe, biologically to an extent, and also just out of morality reasons. And yeah, a lot of my decision of not liking intergender wrestling was a product of my upbringing of unless the female is physically going after you, you are generally going to be heavier, you are generally going to be stronger than that female. You can, do a lot more damage, don't hit women. And it's just a product of our upbringing. So this was a perfect example of where it became uncomfortable. And this was, like I said, this is just me. It is nobody else but me. Jordan Grace and Matt Cardona for the Digital Media Champion, which, as Peanut Gallery said, it's one of those titles that can be fought, won, and defended against the genders, against the opposite gender. And this one was weird because Cardona wrestled at first like he did not want to hit Grace. And Jordan Grace is one of those situations like China where she's bigger, just not tall-wise, but she's physically larger, so she could lift and slam men. And you got the incorrect perception of professional wrestling back in the Carney days because it was more popular for women to face men back in the Carney days. When it became kayfabe, they stopped doing that because you had to suspend your disbelief to a certain amount. Now, obviously, when Toots Montt was competing at that time and when he brought that idea up, that whole thing was taken out because the whole perception of women at that time was very different. But for me, especially when I was watching this match, I was personally uncomfortable like Ryder was. Or not Ryder, Cardona was. Wow, did I just use a slave name? I guess I did. Anyway. So that's just kind of where at least the basis of my argument is that there's just that whole do not hit women thing, and when I see it happen, especially from men, it's just not comfortable. So then there's instances where it's different, like with Jordan Grace, like with China, which I'll be talking about here in a minute, but then let's talk about Nyla Rose, who is a transgender female, born a male, but I think she's had enough of the therapy, the whatever thing, for her to be classified as such. And I think now with wrestling, they're starting to maybe look at this when you're talking about a person who's going through a transition, not from just male to female, but female to male. So Nyla Rose is kind of in a weirder situation, but I think this is antithesis of what wrestling is now. It's kayfabe. This is not a regular sport where it's based on the physical attributes of that individual. It's a choreographed sport. It's a simulation. So in that way, intergender wrestling can work in very rare circumstances like this, but a female who is 90 pounds soaking wet with cinder blocks tied to her ankles is not going to beat a Keith Lee. I don't care if it's a hardcore match and Keith Lee is dead. It's just not going to happen. And there's only a certain amount of suspension of disbelief I'm going to give it until I start rolling my eyes, personally. And once again, China is a different circumstance. She was a bodybuilder. She had the presence, she had the height, she had the muscle mass to have it differently, but also she was booked stronger. And that's the other thing too, women are booked differently than men, and they will always be booked differently because there is a different perception, and there will always be a different perception with a male and a female wrestler, always. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying that there's going to be something different. China, Beth Phoenix, Nyla Rose, Nia Jax, all of them are going to have a difference in that context. So there you go. But then we have the opposite, with Harvey Whippleman winning the women's champion. He was a skinnier, smaller ref, just like or a skinnier, smaller manager, just like Andy Kaufman was a skinnier, smaller comedian. They were not trained and built like what you would perceive as a male wrestler. And I didn't like this either. I didn't like Andy Kaufman doing the intergender stuff. It was just weird, and it made a joke out of the business. There are a lot of people who take this business seriously, and when you start doing this stuff, it just ruins it. It doesn't look good to the eyes of an outsider. Because when you want to bring new people in, you want to show them the best of the best. But when stuff like this was happening, it was hard to do that. Because it's like, why is this guy holding the women's champion? That doesn't look good. I don't want to see that. And here's the other one. Here's another great one where they were actually like physically attacking each other in 2003 when there were intergender matches. Trish Stratus, Lita, who are awesome women's wrestlers, taking on Chris Jericho and Christian, two awesome male wrestlers. You are looking at these two groups, you have to look at them differently. They might have the good physical acumen, they might have a good this, but at a certain point in time, Lita versus Christian, unless she's using underhanded tactics or in a hardcore match like you said, there's going to be a height difference. There's going to be a weight difference. There's going to be a strength difference. It's all going to be different, and there's a point in time when that belief is gone. And taking nothing away from Trish Stratus, Lita, Chris Jericho, or Christian. I just didn't like this. And they tried to make chicken salad out of chicken shit, but there's only so much you can do as it relates to something as, I think, just unbridledly, almost animalistically uncomfortable as a male beating up and hitting a female in one way or another. It's just weird, you know? So there was that, and then you did the same exact thing. There was a sexual aspect with it, and this is a radical, there was a radical difference here, because that was what this match was. It was supposed to be that raunchy thing, and Edge was a rated R superstar. Like, that was just going to be a given based on what was happening in this situation. But, and I've seen this thing happen in multiple males versus female matches where the woman gets spanked or the male doesn't take it seriously. It's a trope that's tired and old, and I think in the world of kayfabe, it just doesn't look good for males. It doesn't look good for professional wrestling, period. Even if they're trying to be as serious as possible, it's just not going to work. And it's going to be really hard to do a digital media champion. Hell, it's kind of awkward when they do the 24/7 champion in that circumstance as well, because it's a joke. And I feel like when they do that kind of stuff, it makes that credibility of that championship or those wrestlers, both genders, as jokes. It's like, why isn't Jordan Grace going for the women's world champion? She's playing around with this stupid social digital media champion. Why? It doesn't make sense to me. Or Matt Cardona, he was going for the male world champion. Why? And I don't believe that males, I think this was not only a disservice to the world champion, but I think this was a disservice to the entire knockouts division at this time for a couple of reasons. Number one, Tessa Blanchard was the hottest thing in wrestling. And why did she have to go for the male world champion? That almost discredits the male world champion because it takes out all of the male wrestlers. It's like, okay, well, what the heck is this? But it also discredits Tessa Blanchard in the knockouts division because it's like, is Tessa Blanchard too good for the knockouts division? You don't want that perception. There was a reason why the ratings dropped when Tessa Blanchard became world champion, because people thought it as a joke. That's what people saw it as. It was exciting at the time. I won't lie to you. I thought it was really exciting. But then when I look at it as a part of hindsight, I'm like, there was a reason why this hasn't happened since. Charlotte Flair is a much better wrestler, period, end of discussion, to Tessa Blanchard by a mile. You don't see her going for a male title. Why? Because she's elevating the women's division. Ronda Rousey's not facing off against males. Why? Because she's elevating the women's division. You shouldn't want to go for the... I'll wrap it up with this just really quick. The women should only be within the confines of the women's division and make it the best thing on wrestling. Then that's the title in the main events. Those are the rating. Those are the things that people want to watch. And them having to go up a level, it's almost like juniors going up against heavyweights. Like, it just feels like a joke. So that's where I'll leave that. So when we come back, we'll do our, 10, 15, 20-minute back and forth on this discussion, and then we'll go from there. All right, so
anyways, I'm gonna wait for you to get off your moral high horse here.
I said it was literally just based on my moral thing about it. I preempted this.
The only reason that Charlotte Flair and Ronda Rousey are not going after male world titles is because they're on the organization they're in. You dimwit, it had nothing to do with.
What about Ronda Rousey and the UFC? She was obviously good enough, and she was rolling through the entire division. Why didn't she go for male titles?
Because they do it based off of weight.
Yeah,
she was in the featherweight division.
Yeah, she was in that's a women's featherweight division. There's a male featherweight division. There's a male lightweight division where actually some of the females are heavier than the males.
I'm pretty sure that is because the regulators would be all over their asses if they did something like that.
Exactly. There is a perception
where
it's hard.
UFC is real fighting.
Yes, it's hard to suspend your disbelief when you're trying to simulate combat. That's what professional wrestling is. It's a simulation of combat.
So you're approaching it from a moralistic, or I guess your moralistic standpoint.
I'm approaching it from not only that moralistic standpoint, but also that it devalues the women's division overall.
I don't think so.
Why did Tessa Blanchard? Well, once again, my argument here: why did Tessa Blanchard have to go for the Impact World Champion? Why couldn't she keep the Knockouts champion and elevate it to the best thing on the show?
Because she already did that.
Yeah. Why did she have to do this?
Because she was in a rivalry with Sami Zayn.
So then the Knockouts are useless.
Not Sami Zayn, Sami Callihan.
So then the Knockouts in a way are useless. Why did she have to go for it in the first place?
Why?
Because this made it to where Tessa Blanchard was so good that she had to face males.
No, it's because she had a rivalry with Sami Callihan.
I'm just telling you.
That had nothing to do with she was too good for the division. She did everything she had to do in the Knockouts division, and it's still the best thing going in Impact Wrestling today.
It's going better now, but when she did that, I think the entire division got hurt from it. Because there wasn't anybody that good, because now everybody is trying to have this as akin to, why doesn't Mickie James go for the world champion? Why doesn't she go for the world champion?
Because that's not her place. That's not. She's not in a rivalry right now with Moose.
Yeah, but once again, who would win in that situation? 6'8", 300+ Moose, or 5'4", 120-pound Mickie James?
Depends on the circumstances. It was inevitable that Tessa Blanchard was going to win out at the end of the day.
It was that, but also I think it's a testament to how bad of a decision this was. Hindsight 2020. Impact was trying to do anything they could to be relevant again, and I think this was a step too much.
They took a risk, but we've talked about it. Impact Wrestling is all about doing that kind of stuff.
Right.
That's just their breeding.
This was just a general example.
Right. No, that's fine. But you're kind of erasing a lot of the history of professional wrestling because because intergender wrestling has always been a part of professional wrestling.
There was the strong style version of it where a lot of women weren't in it. Why? Because they couldn't beat males. There were only a handful of women at that time that could legitimately beat male wrestlers, and that were tough enough to take that punishment. Mae Young, Fabulous Moolah, maybe what's her name, Mildred Burke, but they had, at that point they already had a women's world champion in the NWA. They didn't have to face males at that time.
Right. And, again, this was one of the extremes where you have to suspend your disbelief way too much.
Exactly. No, that's fine. Right. But when you're trying to do a debate, you have to go with the extremes.
Right, you have to. And that's why I went with the other extremes.
It better illustrates your point with this. If Tessa Blanchard was maybe the size of a Nia Jax or a Nyla Rose or a Chyna, I would be okay with this.
Right.
But she looked like every other woman. A lot smaller, a lot shorter than the others.
Right.
And
I think the only reason that she got to that position is because of Sami Callihan. And again, you have to consider the context in which she won the world title. If it was anybody else, it would not have been that way. But that they legitimately had a blood feud going. There is only one direction to go. Unfortunately, Impact Wrestling painted themselves into a corner with this particular rivalry. But
and then she was doing moves and stuff on Brian Cage. You legitimately you cannot sit here and tell me that she would have beaten Brian Cage.
Oh God, no.
We've talked with Brian Cage. He's a cool dude, but my God, that guy's built like a brick house.
There's unless she was doing some underhanded tactics, there's no legitimate way that Tessa Blanchard. And that's what makes it. That's why you have to suspend your disbelief.
But there are other circumstances too. Now keep in mind of the demographic of a traditional professional wrestling fan, and I know this is going to piss a lot of people off, but we are not the cream of the fucking crop here. There's a lot of sexual tension there, and it's just been ingrained within. It's been ingrained within the bowels of professional wrestling.
Have you been to an AEW show recently? It's full of those kinds of people.
And guess what? Yeah, they're the most toxic fucking fans in the world. But here's the thing: this kind of stuff does not make the industry look good. That's why I don't like intergender wrestling, because it's why do you have males versus females? That's just a culture that we're in right now. You don't hit women. Period. If you're a male.
Wow. Well, that's a very traditional way of looking at it.
It is. I'm sorry. It's almost the way it is right now.
No,
Are you kidding me?
It's not that way.
I mean, obviously, I'm not going to run up there and punch a chick in the face for no reason. I'm not going to do that with a male.
Well, yeah, but I think again, you are sticking to the traditional gender role. Don't hit women. No,
I preempted. That's why I preempted my argument from moment one that you and I were raised in a traditional way, and that's what blanket my perception of intergender wrestling.
Yes, which again, that's your opinion, but that's not the facts. The facts is that this has been a piece of wrestling lore for as long as wrestling has been a professional wrestling.
But the thing is that generally it's going to be a larger woman or a smaller male doing it.
Of course. But that's how it's always been, is that there has to be some level of believability with it. Now, with this instance, for example, with the Edge, he was a sexual deviant, sexual predator at the time. That was his
Right. Once again, big extreme.
right. But that was his genre. That was him. Meaning,
Right.
This
Well, then there's something like this where it was a traditional match, and I think this is the most egregious part of this, where you have.
And I think this was Eric Bischoff trying to be a little more.
Well, okay, this was a storyline written thing.
This is all storyline driven. You have to understand.
Yes, that's why we didn't compare it to other sports, because other sports are not based on predetermined
right. But
results.
If this was a normal match, it's hard to believe. It's hard to have that believability because Trish Stratus and Lita are not the biggest, strongest looking athletes in the world, and
compared to
males.
males.
Right.
That's not sexist. That's just reality. Right. They were shorter, smaller, and not as built muscularly as men. And that's just women in general. Period.
You would have had to have.
Well, maybe not general, but for the most part.
But again, that is just that again. You have to suspend your disbelief, and I think that intergender wrestling, in some parts and pieces, they do take it too far. Like this is a good example of them maybe skirting that line between believability and not believability. But compare that to, for example, today with the Digital Media Championship.
Okay, let's go to that one since I have that picture.
There's a little. So the Digital Media Championship started out with six men, that six-way match, right? There were a lot of spots and weapons and blah, blah, blah involved in that match. We saw that match live.
That one, yes. But not this one. This one was a traditional one-on-one.
But again, Jordynne Grace looks like someone who can take down a male. Because, again, she has done that before.
She's a power lifter. She's a bodybuilder.
Right, so that makes it more believable.
But once again, even though Jordynne Grace is going to be that woman as that rare exception, there's still a perception here because Matt Cardona is still taller, he's still heavier, and he's still built muscularly different.
But he's a chicken shit.
Right. He did use a chair.
Again, storyline driven sort of stuff.
I understand. In any circumstance, I will be more comfortable any day of the week of having intergender professional wrestling than like MMA. I hate it when transgender females face women females because they're going to kill them, and we're seeing that right now.
Oh yeah, but again,
that's different.
But again, that is a different.
It's a totally different animal, right?
Males cannot face females in MMA. I mean, that's just given.
Well, in certain circumstances, like the UFC, the pinnacle of what it is, do not allow it for that literal reason because they know
they're going to get regulated out to the shitter.
Right. But there are some MMA divisions that do have transgendered fight natural-born women, natural-born males, and it just doesn't work, period.
But that's a totally different conversation.
Right, it is a totally different conversation.
What we're talking about is a simulated entertainment style. And
yes.
In this situation, this makes sense, not only from a storyline angle, but also just from a believability angle. I can believe that Jordynne Grace can go toe-to-toe with Matt Cardona.
Yeah, well, as a person who's trying to do a debate, I'm trying to be as balanced as possible because there are the Jordynne Grace exceptions.
Right. Same thing with, like, Nia Jax. Same thing with Beth Phoenix. Same thing with
another great example of this is Dana Brooke, who has the power. She is a bodybuilder, so credibility, but also keep in mind of who the other people are that are going after the 24/7 division. You have Akira Tozawa and R-Truth. They're not the biggest guys in the world, but I don't see Dana Brooke beating Drew McIntyre or Roman Reigns anytime soon.
No, that's never gonna happen.
It's a situation-based thing, and I think this is one of those things where I am under the impression that if you have to do all or none of it. And it's hard for me to do that when they have like these separate divisions because it's Digital Media Champions. It seems like a joke.
So keep this in mind too, that this has always been a piece to the history of professional wrestling. Professional wrestling has always had this sort of intergender reality, even if it's not in the forefront. It's still part of reality, and this is what is this is what's getting more and more popular now.
Right.
So that's why it's a little more into the forefront. And Impact Wrestling always push the extremes with that.
Right. And then China's going to be a different circumstance because she was so popular that they legitimately were going to put the world championship on her at one time. And I think WWE had the foresight saying that would be ridiculous. Because
in that era, it would be, yes.
Well, yeah, because keep in mind who was going for those. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Kane, Undertaker. You think China's going to beat fucking Undertaker? Hell no.
No. But again, you have to consider the times in which they were doing this. Now, putting a world title on a woman is risky. A men's world title, because that's the face of your brand. Not saying that it's a bad thing, but it's a very risky decision to make because, especially in this era, you have to get the biggest ratings possible. And
women want to. I don't know about you, but when I see two badass women in a big match, that's a main event to me. I don't care. Like Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair. That was the main event of night one of WrestleMania, not because of clout chasing, because that was the best program WWE at that time. There was no other place where that match could have gone other than the main event.
It was still just the women's champion. It was the WWE champion, that sort of thing.
But I don't think that should be the priority. If you're in the main event, you can go for the Intercontinental champion. I don't care. It's the main event. Mm-hmm. And I think if a woman is going to be so awesome, like Charlotte Flair, like Ronda Rousey, like Becky Lynch, who are the best thing on WWE at this time. I don't care if the name on the title is not, the women's title or the world title. That's the best title right now because that has the best wrestler, that has the best storylines, that has the best general outcome of the match. Right. That makes a world champion. I can slap a world champion moniker on any belt. It doesn't matter. The world title means that you are the best of the best. And if you are at the last match on a big show with the best rivalry, that is the world champion of that promotion.
Yeah, well,
maybe that's another conversation. Maybe that's another thing of the fluidity of rankings of championships.
Yeah,
because that's another good one.
And again, that is kind of that's a perception of just eras this is bygone era sort of stuff.
Right.
That's why women's championships are not held in as high regard, is because of that perceived ranking of championships. Now,
hopefully that will be gone soon because I don't. Obviously, my consensus, it doesn't really matter. If you're the last match, you're the world champion.
Right. Well,
You're the face of the fucking company. I don't care if you're going up against Brock Lesnar. If Brock Lesnar is the first, if Brock Lesnar is before your match, you are the face of the company. I don't care if it's a WWE champion.
Well, I think in my opinion, I would make a WWE championship for the women's division. It would just be called the WWE champion.
They tried to do that with the NXT champion with the women, and it threw people off really hard because when people are looking it up, how are algorithms going to distinguish that?
Right.
I'm sorry.
Well, they just have put parentheses men,
unless
women.
They tried to do that, and it didn't work.
Well, because they botched that to hell.
Yeah,
but again, that's another debate we can have about maybe possibly renaming certain championships to more equally emphasize what they are.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I would have a different argument. Maybe that's a debate for another time. So I think we kind of have a good little back and forth there. So, Peanut Gallery, as of right now, I think we actually have a topic for another day. I'll put that down in our list. But if there is a debate that you want us to actually talk about, or if there is a discussion, let us know. Right now, we're kind of up in the air of what we're going to be doing next week.
But there is one thing that I know for sure next week. It's going to be a Saturday show.
Why?
Because of the Super Bowl.
Oh, that's right.
We
yes.
always do Super Bowl weekend shows on Saturday.
Right.
Because we will not be in any mood to do it after Super Bowl on Sunday.
Right.
So,
Thank God there's no pay-per-view.
So-
Maybe that's why there isn't one.
yeah, that's why there isn't one. But anyways, so yes, special Saturday show, topic to be determined.
Yes, and if you did enjoy this, remember to like this video or the podcast, subscribe or follow, whatever you do. Share with all your friends, become a patron. All the links are down below. And as always, be
Majestic.